Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack, and today's episode picks up where the last episode left off. In the last episode, we talked about avoidance and defensiveness and about what happens when something feels too uncomfortable to examine. And often, what follows defensiveness isn't silence, it's explanation. Because most avoidance doesn't sound like avoidance. It sounds reasonable. It sounds thoughtful. It sounds grounded. And it sounds like storytelling, a story that justifies staying exactly where we are. So that's where today's episode picks up. Today, I want to talk about rationalization and minimization, not as moral failures, but as defense mechanisms, and as the language we use to protect ourselves from looking more closely and having to sit in discomfort. When people hear the word rationalization, sometimes they think of dishonesty, white lies. But most rationalization isn't about lying to other people. It's meaning making. It's telling ourselves a story that helps us stay comfortable. Rationalization is what allows us to say, that makes total sense. This is normal. It isn't a big deal. And the story or the meaning that we make works, at least in the short term. It lowers tension in ourselves, resolves discomfort, and it lets us move on without having to look too deeply at anything or asking us to change anything. All of us as humans are prone to using defense mechanisms. And rationalization and minimization, and when we pick out these two, rationalization and minimization, as with other defense mechanisms, are not signs of low intelligence, a lack of education, a lack of insight, or emotional immaturity. In fact, very thoughtful, articulate, self aware people are often especially good at them. Not because they tend to be more dishonest, but because they're more skilled with language, with logic, and meaning making. Smart people can build coherent narratives. They can explain context. They can see nuance and multiple sides of an issue. And those are real strengths until they're used to protect something instead of examining it. Insight lives in the mind, whereas growth happens through lived experience. Smart people often understand why they do something long before they're willing or able to feel a need to change. And that gap can be uncomfortable. Having knowledge, having awareness, but also not moving towards that, and instead wanting to stay in comfort, that gap can be uncomfortable. So, insight or logic or education or whatever we want to call it can get used as a substitute for transformation. I know where this comes from quietly replaces I need to do something different. That insight becomes armor instead of a doorway into change and growth. Being smart doesn't exempt someone from wanting to feel comfortable. It doesn't exempt someone from wanting to feel right. I think that desire to feel right is a very human desire. intelligence doesn't cancel out our human desire for certainty or ease or relief from discomfort. In some ways, it actually intensifies it. Smart people are often rewarded for being right, for being reasonable and articulate, for having good explanations. I've been engaged in conversations with people who are smart and educated, and I think they have good insight, and we're having a good conversation, like a normal language conversation. And sometimes in the conversation, I say something or I make a statement or I ask a question, maybe not directly of them, but a generalized question. And all of a sudden, I notice this easy conversation we were having instead is what I call an academic response, where I'm going to have to pull out my dictionary and my thesaurus to make sense of what all of a sudden they were saying. Whereas before, the conversation seemed to flow pretty easy. And in the moment, I would say that's confusing. Often I think to myself, I totally lost the conversation. I usually think, wait, was I not paying attention? Was I oversimplifying things in the conversation? What happened here? Why am I all of a sudden confused? Instead of seeing, oh, they pivoted into their logic or they pivoted into their lane of expertise as a way to navigate around that part of the conversation that got uncomfortable or hit on something too personal. So when something challenges people's behavior or perspective, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It can feel destabilizing. It can feel like a judgment. It can even feel like an attack when that's not how it's phrased or positioned. Being right isn't just soothing, it's familiar. And for some people, it's expected that they're deferred to, it's expected that they're seen as right. And often it's where competence lives and even where an identity has been built. So when that conversation is happening and they pivot or they feel like there's an attack and they get defensive, it's usually because something in the conversation challenged a part of themselves. That's why they felt attacked, not necessarily that the conversation was attacking, even that the person knew that about them. Often we can build our identity on foundations that shouldn't be something that can support a whole identity. When rationalization and minimization start to work together, it often stalls personal growth for the sake of comfort. And rationalization and minimization don't just affect relationships. They have a profound impact on the person using them. One of the biggest personal costs is that they quietly stall growth. One of the truths about growth is that it requires friction. It requires staying with discomfort long enough for something new to form. Rationalization removes that friction. It creates resolution without asking for any transformation. Over time, narratives harden into identity. People don't stop functioning, but they do stop evolving. This is where we sometimes hear language about my truth, quote unquote. That phrase, well, this is my truth, can quietly become a shield when truth becomes something we defend rather than something we examine. our quest for truth stops and we stop growing. Curiosity will get replaced with certainty. And yeah, certainty feels good, but it doesn't deepen us. Minimization works by shrinking the impact of something until it feels manageable. Minimization might sound like you're blowing this out of proportion. It's not that deep, or it's not that complex. This isn't really an issue. The purpose of minimization is that it doesn't remove the problem. What it does remove, though, is urgency. And when urgency disappears, accountability usually does too. Let me give you an example of minimization that I heard recently. So I was listening to a focus group that Sarah Longwell on the Bulwark does. A lot of times listening to focus groups, like I am interested in what voters think. And a lot of times it makes me want to scratch my eyeballs because it's incredibly frustrating to me too. The lack of critical thinking. And so this particular focus group, she was interviewing voters who had voted for Biden and then in 2024 voted for Trump. She was asking about several things. She was asking about what's been happening currently in Minneapolis and St. Paul. She was asking them about ICE and the shooting and murder of Renee Good. They were also asking them about the Epstein files. And then they were also talking about the economy and their views on that and what they voted for. And when they were talking about the Epstein files, so I don't know exactly how it works. It seems like they'll ask a question and people can go up and record their answer into a mic, record what they're thinking. But sometimes I think other people in the group can hear them. I'm guessing they're not all in the same room, that it's done virtually. I don't actually know. So the first person to get up and talk about the Epstein files was a male, I think 30s, 40s, maybe something like that. And his comment about the Epstein files was, I think this is something we've always known, that the powerful often prey on women. So I think this is just general knowledge, and we don't need to really see the files. Like, we can take it or leave it. We already know that this happens. It's already part of our society. And Sarah, when she was talking to the guest, who was also listening to the focus group, did say when that first man went and answered and said what he thought about the Epstein files, that most of the other participants were like, no, 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 that's not how it is. And that the rest did have some concerns about what looks like stalling, covering up, hiding, and protecting. And so as I was preparing this podcast episode and thinking about minimization, I think that's a good example of minimizing. He wasn't saying that it doesn't happen. He wasn't saying that we don't need to know about it. But he was saying, we already know about it. Why do we need to see these files? And my thought is, well, there's victims. That would be completely overstepping victims who want some semblance of justice, who want the truth to come out, who have been silenced, intimidated, and gaslit since this happened. That's why it's important that these files come out unredacted with the truth, not removing the names of the perpetrators. It's a way of saying, hey, here are these people. Here are the men who were involved in this, who were committing these horrible crimes. And regardless of how powerful or well liked or well respected or looked up to they are, we need to know about this. We need to face the truth of who these are, the power that they hold, and what happened to the victims. And that's what I mean when I say when urgency disappears, accountability usually does too. And the people who are in these files, they knew that, banked on that. This case is long overdue to come into the public awareness and consciousness and to give justice to the victims. Now, there's another layer to rationalization and minimization, especially for thoughtful people. Many of us are far more comfortable with answers than we are with questions. I think kids, young kids, they'll ask you a million questions. They'll ask you questions you've never even thought about. But at some point, asking questions stops. And we replace it with a need to know. And sometimes, even if we do have a question, we don't want to reveal that we don't know. And so we don't ask the question. And I'm not saying there's not an importance to having answers. Answers feel productive. They feel grounding in that they give us something to stand on. Questions, especially open-ended ones, don't do that. They keep things unresolved. They ask us to stay present without knowing where we'll land. The quest for answers is often framed as curiosity. But sometimes the quest for answers is not curiosity, it's relief seeking, in that answers calm anxiety. They reduce ambiguity. They give the nervous system something solid to hold. And when we get an answer, even a partial one, our internal tension can drop. Whereas holding questions, wondering, doesn't offer that relief. Instead, wondering asks us to tolerate not knowing. Wondering keeps things open. It doesn't let us move on. It doesn't let us feel finished. And for people who value competence, insight, or being thoughtful, wondering can feel inefficient, even irresponsible. Like we're wasting time and not doing something and not moving forward with something we should already understand. Like we're just dilly-dallying, daydreaming. Answers and seeking out answers can become a substitute for real growth. I think one of the ways that rationalization shows up is through premature answers. I already know why I do this, so I don't have to keep asking myself that. Oh yeah, this comes from my past, so we're not going to discuss it. Or I love this one. This is just how I'm wired. Is it? I don't know. None of those statements are necessarily wrong, but when they shut down further wondering, there's not insight. Instead, they just start being conclusions. Answers can become a way to stop asking deeper questions, to go one layer deep and decide that's enough. I don't have to go deeper. When I was going through my faith deconstruction, I found two quotes that were like a breath of fresh air. I grew up in a church, and I think a lot of religions are this way, not all, but I grew up in a church that was very focused on answers and certainty. That was actually part of my struggle in the church for most of my adult life. I felt like when I was younger and coming from the family background that I did, I was comfortable with the answers that the church I grew up in offered. And it felt like some guidance that I could trust. It felt like some type of map for figuring out the world. When I knew that my parents didn't quite figure some things out. But I had questions as an adult in the church. Often I would go read things, I would read various books to try to find answers to my questions. I liked thinking about questions, and I wasn't always satisfied with answers. Sometimes the answers felt rote. They weren't individual, they weren't unique to me and my experience. It seemed like the answers I was given were big T truth for everyone. No small T truths that could vary from individual to individual. And that started to feel constricting. It started to feel like it was either me or other people's comfort. So the first quote that I found is by M. Scott Peck. And he writes, "A life of total dedication to the truth also means a life of willingness to be personally challenged." And I felt like that gave me permission. It also told me, okay, if you want to seek out the truth, you're going to have to be willing to also be challenged, because we can get stuck in a truth that is very comfortable and just reinforces the biases and insecurities that we have and calms our insecurities that are already there. So, okay, I thought, all right, I do want to search out truth, big T, little t, all of it. And I'm okay to be personally challenged. And then I found this quote by Dostoevsky. I don't think I have said this, but when I was in high school, we were reading Crime and Punishment. And that year for my birthday, I don't remember asking for this, but that year for my birthday, I got two parakeets. And so I named one Raskolnikov and one Dostoevsky. I just thought they were cool names from that book. Anyway, so this was a quote, not in Crime and Punishment, but this was a quote by Dostoevsky. And he says, quote, "It's not as a child that I believe in Christ and profess him. My Hosanna has passed through a great crucible of doubt." And I don't know why that seemed so comforting to me. I've told other people who are going through faith deconstruction about that quote, and they're kind of like, uh-huh, okay. It doesn't feel like the reassurance that it was to me. And maybe it was unique to some things that I was struggling with in my deconstruction, in that part of my deconstruction was letting go of what I was given as a child for what I know now as an adult, for what I believe, what I profess, and the ability to also update that and know there's a possibility of outgrowing what I know, what I quote unquote know, and know that there's a possibility of outgrowing what I know or what I believe. As part of my deconstruction, I started in my notes app on my iPhone, I started a what I know for sure. I'm not talking about big T truths in there. Maybe I am, but I'm also just talking about what I know at this age, right? And I would put a date on it so I knew what age that was. And one of the things I had put on there is what I know for sure is that at 45 years old, I don't like seafood. I don't like it in any form. I don't care how it's cooked. I've tried all the ways it's cooked. I don't care where it comes from. I don't care who's prepared it. I just don't like it. And I had probably spent, I don't know, close to a decade of my life trying. So I was with a friend of mine in Maryland, and we were there for a professional thing. And he took me to this small city. He was living there at the time, and a cute little town in Maryland, kind of a beach town. And this was end of summer, early fall, so kind of shutting down. But we went and we were deciding where we wanted to eat for dinner that night. And he was suggesting a place. I said, I don't like seafood. And he looked at me and said, Really? And I said, Yeah. And I've tried it. I've tried cooking it all the different ways. I've tried ordering it all the different ways. And it's just one of those things that I know for sure in my life at this time. I don't like it. I don't think I'm going to like it. I haven't liked it. I've tried it. I don't like it. And he offered something like my age, he was older than me. He said, Here's what I know for sure. And he offered something he knew for sure about him. I'm not saying that's a truth for anybody else, but that was a truth that I was going to claim and accept for myself. Sometimes when I'm asked, What do you think about the afterlife? Do you believe in an afterlife? I'll say, My thinking on this at the moment is because I give myself room that may update. I don't know. Obviously, I can't know that for sure. And I don't like when people tell me in certainty, here's what happens. It doesn't have to be about the afterlife or things like that. But sometimes when I'm asked a question, I answer that way. I can say, what I know for sure for me is, or my thinking on this at the moment is this. And there's a difference between knowing and being curious. Curiosity asks us to tolerate not knowing. Knowing is finite. Curiosity is relational. Knowing says, I know this, or I've concluded this. Curiosity says, there may be more. Knowing curiosity tolerates an openness, the possibility that things evolve. And growth almost always lives on the curiosity side, not the certainty side. For most people, unanswered questions can feel especially uncomfortable because unanswered questions can feel like incompetence or weakness or a lack of mastery. So instead of sitting with the question, we rush toward explanation. We gather information, we form theories, we reach conclusions. And in doing so, we protect ourselves from the vulnerability of not knowing yet or updating our thinking. And sometimes I will say what I thought or what I believed or what I knew at 25 or 30 years old isn't the same thing that I thought about or believed at 40 or 50. I'll say being a business owner, 5 years in, I knew some things, I had learned some things, but at 11 years in, I've learned other things. Not that those things weren't true, but maybe they weren't certain. I think wondering can be a skill that we often bypass. Wondering isn't a lack of intelligence. It's a capacity to stay present without resolution, to hold paradox without collapsing it, to allow something to unfold instead of forcing it to fit a certain box or to make sense. And that capacity is what rationalization quietly erodes. Sometimes we need to answer. Do you want a Diet Coke? No, not today. I'm good. Sometimes we just need an answer. Sometimes we need facts and data, but not all the time. Sometimes the most honest place to stand isn't in an answer. It's in a question. And not a question we're trying to solve, but a question we're willing to live with for a while. Growth doesn't always come from figuring things out, from arriving at knowledge. Sometimes it comes from staying curious longer than feels comfortable. And this is the part we often miss. Questions don't just keep things open, they keep us alive. They keep us noticing. Questions require continued thinking, continued reading, listening, asking, discussing, exploring, and reflecting. And that process is not a weakness. It's how our mind stays sharp and flexible. When we settle too quickly into answers, our thinking can become static. We stop revising. We stop updating. We stop seeking out or integrating new information. Questions actually keep the brain moving, challenged, and keep the brain working. Curiosity strengthens our ability to tolerate complexity, to hold nuance, and to adapt when new information challenges what we already believe. So yes, certainty feels safe, but curiosity builds capacity. How does this impact relationships? In relationships, rationalization often lands as dismissal. One person may be talking about the impact, something they experienced, and the other person responds more with an explanation or a conclusion, like something that just wraps that up instead of deepens the conversation. And over time, the person raising a concern or sharing starts to feel like the problem, simply for noticing something that doesn't fit the story, something that makes the other person uncomfortable. And not because they're wrong, it's because stories have replaced curiosity. My two best friends from high school, our birthdays are spread out throughout the year. One's in February, mine's in May, the other one's in September. So we're hitting a good 3/4 of the year getting together for our birthdays. And we did that regularly. There was a couple of years that I lived out of state, and so we didn't do that. But once I moved home and we were all living in Utah, married, raising kids, we started getting together for each other's birthdays. And we did that for probably 15 years, maybe a little bit longer. And then COVID hit. Maybe I'm thinking I'm younger than I am. We obviously didn't do it that year. And we've talked about doing it since, and we just haven't. We're all busy. We all have busy careers that keep us moving in different directions. Last year, I saw them a couple of times, but for parents' funerals. When we would get together regularly, we would talk about our families. They talk about their parents. They'd ask me how my parents were, how my siblings were. We knew each other's families. My parents had divorced. Neither of their parents had. My one friend, her dad passed away. He was young. I was in grad school. I came home for Christmas, went back for school, and I want to say he passed away in January. It seemed like it wasn't that long since I had been home for Christmas. So I flew back for that funeral, and her mom is still alive. I think her mom is the only parent of the three of us that's still alive and in good health and seems to be still going strong. And so we talk about families, we talk about updates when siblings got married, when siblings were doing different things. I talked about when my parents got divorced. And there were times I would open up a little bit more and they'd ask me, "Do you see your dad very much?" And I'd say, "No, I don't really see him at all." Because there were times that we didn't see him at all, didn't know where he was. And then there were times where I'd say, "Yeah, we see him like once a year for about an hour." And I know that they felt something. They felt that they had good relationships with their dads. And I think it was uncomfortable for them that I didn't. And so sometimes they'd be like, "Oh, I remember your dad. He was a good guy." And I'd think to myself, did my dad ever even speak to you? I don't know that my dad knew who you were. My dad really didn't know what was going on in my life. And I think one time I did say, "Did my dad ever talk to you?" And they were like, "Well, no." I was like, "Right. Okay. I didn't think so." And I would say, I'm okay with the reality that my dad wasn't really a good guy. And I could tell that was uncomfortable for them. And it usually didn't lead to more discussions. That was usually the end of it. And I didn't feel bad that they had good relationships with their dads. But I think discomfort or something got in the way of curiosity. I don't know that they could hold space for my reality with my dad. So here's a question to sit with and just see how this lands. What story do I tell myself that lets me stop wondering or that requires me to not have to think anymore or to reflect or to ask deeper questions? Not because you're bad or because that's failing, but because awareness is the beginning of growth. And often growth is uncomfortable. Final thing I want to say about rationalization and minimization is those things don't mean that we don't care. We are all prone to falling into defense mechanisms. They protect us. We may care, but sometimes we don't know how to stay with discomfort without moving to protect ourselves. But what we explain away or push to the side doesn't actually disappear. And I've said this repeatedly in podcasts. It goes underground, it goes back into the subconscious or unconscious, but it doesn't go away. So next time, we're going to talk about, well, I'll have an episode in between these two, but the next one in this series, I am building to a series of episodes for February. So in the next podcast that is me solo doing it, we're going to talk about what happens when those stories that we tell ourselves turn into secrecy and when private patterns begin shaping our lives in ways that we can no longer ignore. Because growth doesn't come from having better answers. I truly think it comes from being willing to live inside better questions. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.